So it's 8 o'clock, so we're going to get started because people shouldn't be punished for being here on time. Dr. McNeil was supposed to be here, but is in Miami being a visiting professor. So she said I could introduce myself. So I'm still Bob Arnold. I'm a palliative care doctor, and I got asked to talk a little bit about reviewing an article. I want you to be able to do a couple of things at the end of this talk. How many have you have reviewed an article for a journal? So about 2/3. How many of you haven't? How many of you would like to review more? So the ones who haven't reviewed all said, oh yeah. So, okay, we're going to talk about what your role is, what the questions are to ask, and how to write a review. Are there other things for those of you who have reviewed or those of you who haven't reviewed that you want me to talk about? That you have questions about when you review articles that you say, ooh, I came to this talk because there was no free breakfast and I just really wanted to hear about how to review an article. My insomnia has gotten that bad. So is there anything else you want to make sure that I talk about? Okay. So, the first question is, what's your role? And your role is basically to help the editors determine what should be published. Now, you don't decide whether it should be published, because I've taken articles and said, oh my God, I would reject them, and the editors have wanted to publish them. And the editors want to publish them for a whole bunch of reasons, only one of which is the scientific validity of the study, because editors have lots of other jobs. One of the jobs, you may be surprised to know, is to get in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and so they're more willing to publish things that are a little edgy that will get public press. So your job is to say, how important is it, how convincing is it, to help the editors make that decision. The other job you have is to help the authors improve their article. And I really think that's something that's really important, which is your job is to help the editors, help the authors figure out what they could do to make the article better, rather than bring an attitude of, you idiot, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z? The other thing I would tell you is that, and this isn't here, part of your job is to help the editor see what a kind and compassionate person you are. Because do you know how they decide who gets to write editorials in about half the time? Anybody have an idea? How do they choose who writes the editorial for articles? It's a dartboard. No. Okay. Good guess though. Huh? Someone wrote a really good review. About half the time they come to you and say, we want to publish this, will you write the editorial on it? The other thing is, the world is pretty small. I'm a general internist and palliative care doctor, and trust me, I remember the assholes who wrote mean-spirited reviews of special editions that I edited, and I would never want to work with them or ask them to do anything else again. And there are those people who view their job as a reviewer is to show you how smart they are and how dumb the authors are. Don't be that person. How do you get asked to review? Because about a third of you said, I've never done it. The first thing is, for those of you who haven't, and the majority of you who haven't ever reviewed, you're relatively young, ask your mentors. I probably get asked to review something, oh my God, every other week. I have no interest in reviewing something every other week. On the other hand, if it's a topic that any of my mentees are interested in, I'm more than willing to have my mentee review it, because it's a good way for my mentee to see what else is out there. It's a skill that you can add to your CV. And so, oh my goodness, I'm more than willing to have mentees review it, because then I can read it pretty quickly. I can read the review, give some comments on the review, and be done. So ask your mentors. Say, I want to review some articles. They're more than glad to do it. Ask the journal editors. So if you do decision analysis and you say, I really would like to review something, send an email to the, medical decision making and say that you'd like to be a reviewer. Because you might think it's really easy. It's really hard to find reviewers. I'm an editor for a couple of things. And first of all, you don't know everybody. And second of all, people say no a lot. And so having someone who wants to review is a great thing. The final thing is when any of you get asked to review and you can't review, they always ask you, who would you recommend? And so if they know that you want to review, we'll recommend you. Should you accept the assignment? So you get asked to review. Should you say no? Why should you agree? One is it builds your CV, right? Two is it builds relationships so that people get to know you. And it's important that people get to know you in your field that you want to sort of have a footprint in. It allows you to be a better writer because you get to see what good writing is and bad writing is. And so one of the ways to be a better writer is to be a better reader. And it allows you to understand what's going on in the field. People can come sit in the first two rows because Christian's feeling a little lonely. And both he and I showered within a day or two?
Yeah.
Okay. So feel free to come sit up front. But you don't have to, because, seriously, it's only my ego. Okay, why shouldn't you be a reviewer? Well, one of the reasons not to be a reviewer is you don't feel like you can be honest. That is, you have a conflict. Now, so it may be if you're reviewing your mentor's paper, when you were at the University of Pennsylvania and now you come here and they send you an article by your mentor and you don't think that you can review it honestly, you shouldn't review it. In fields that are relatively small fields, you can't say I won't review the paper if I know anybody on the paper, because once you get old and you know a lot of people, you would never review anything. So my question is, can you be honest? Can you be objective? The other thing is you need to be somewhat knowledgeable in the area. So I'm a palliative care doctor, so I often get asked to review things that look at pharmacokinetics of an opiate, and it's sort of like, yeah, I know a little bit about it, but I don't know enough about it to review. And so just say, no, it's not an area that I know enough about. Other reasons to say no is you're too busy. The one thing is, if you say yes, don't be late in your review. Because editors hate that. You know who else hates it? The authors. There is nothing worse than sending your paper to the Journal of Self-Importance, and 9 months later, they haven't got the reviewer to read it, and then the reviewer reads it and they reject it. There is nothing worse. Well, there are probably some things worse, but they involve torture and shit. Right? Seriously? So if you're too busy, just say no. They're used to people saying no. It's not a big deal. If you say yes, be on time. If you want to review it and it's going to take you a month and they say 2 weeks, just say, I need a month. Do you still want me to review it? They will always say yes. Unless you're New England Journal or JAMA. But everybody else says yes. Because most people say they're going to be on time and then are late. It used to be the case, and I don't know if Annals still does it, but Annals used to have like the top 5 reviewers. They would send you a letter if you were in the top 5% of reviewers. And one of their criteria for being in the top 5% of the reviewers is that you were on time. The other thing is, if you get asked to do it and you don't feel like it, just say no. If you say no, be polite. Let them know you'd be willing to do it in the future. Now, when I say be polite, I mean, have any of you gotten sort of, they ask you to review something and you really don't want to? And so you just don't respond at all? That is not polite. Because if they don't know that you don't want to do it, they don't ask the next person. And again, who does it hurt? The authors. All of you want to be an author. So a little golden rule stuff is never a bad thing. Just click the no. If you want to do it in the future, say, I can't do it because of this. I'd love to do it in the future. Suggest some other people. Make sure they have your contact information. Okay? Who does good reviews? There is some data on this. There's some science. It's interesting. Younger people do better reviews. Now, why do younger people do better reviews?
Put more effort into it.
They put more effort into it. It's basically a time work ratio. Younger people haven't done it as much, so they're like, ooh, this is my first review. It's like so exciting to do a review. So they read the paper 3 times, they write really careful comments, they proofread their comments. And I do it, in between driving my children somewhere and dictate my comments and don't proofread them. So younger people, a fair amount of data, do better reviews. Being on an editorial board, they do worse reviews. Why? Probably because they're older and busier. Training in epidemiology or statistics do better reviews. Spending more than 3 hours, first of all, people lie if they say they spent more than 3 hours on a review. Spending more than 3 hours on a review probably doesn't make it better. Okay, so this is like if you showed up on time, you got one of these, or if you sat in front, you got one. We're going to run after the people in the back. There's a message there. I have 2 left. Who doesn't? I'll have to share. Okay, I want people to spend 10 minutes, because I know you didn't read this. I want you to spend 10 minutes looking at the article. Because we're going to review this article going through how you would review an article. Okay? This is an article that came out 3 weeks ago in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. I chose it because I thought it was a really interesting topic and I was giving the talk, so I got to choose the article. It's a relatively prestigious journal, sort of in the sort of scoring metrics, and so their science is usually pretty good. So 10 minutes is 15 after, 25 after, we'll reconvene. Okay, 3 minutes. Okay, so when you review an article, this sort of what I typically do is I read it once, just sort of fast through, and I say to myself, is this important? What does it add to the literature? What does it add to your clinical practice? For me, this was an important article because there is a big push in both palliative care and in oncology to ask patients to sort of report their symptoms. And so it's a really different model of care. And it looked at two outcomes that I thought were important, both outcomes that a health system would care about and outcomes that a patient would care about. What did you all think from reading it quickly? Did it seem important? So my other question is it well done? Methodologically, are there things about it that made me think, this is well done? Is it well written? Does the length seem appropriate? Do the tables seem appropriate? One of the questions that I ask myself is it humble? Often what authors do is they write conclusions that the data doesn't really support. And so I want to ask myself, is it humble? And do the conclusions are they aware of their own limitations and things that might not work in different health systems? And the other thing is, does it tell a story? That is, often what you'll get is you'll get articles where they give you all the data and you're supposed to interpret it and figure out what they're really saying. I don't want to work that hard. Articles ought to tell a story. They ought to have a point of view. I don't have to agree with the point of view, and yet this article makes an argument that we ought to be doing patient-reported symptom outcomes. It tells a very clear story about why it believes it. Articles that don't tell a story, I basically will never accept. I'll always say it needs to be revised. They need to be clear about what their story is. The second reading is for gathering of evidence for your decisions. It's for writing notes for your letter. It's for clarifying your points. And remember, your goal is not only to give the editors feedback, but help the authors make their article better. So if there are things that you can suggest, even if you decide to reject it, they get your comments. So if they read and say, if I did that, it would make the article a lot better, that's a really helpful thing. Because it's almost always the case that I might not decide to agree with your comments, but if I've sent it to 3 journals and all the reviewers say the same things like, I need to respond to that. Okay, what shouldn't you say in your review? Don't tell them that they should have done a different article. That's just not helpful. It's like, the food was really good, but I was hoping for pizza. Well, you're in a Chinese restaurant. That doesn't help the restaurant. I mean, they're not going to make pizza. They sent you Chinese food. They want you to review Chinese food. I mean, what would you think if the review said, I was really hoping for pizza? Like, as an editor, it's not helpful. And as an author, it's really not helpful. If you wish they would have done a little different analysis to answer a question, that's helpful. Do not tell them that you wish they would have done something else. Not helpful. Okay, so the abstract should summarize the article, the story should be clear. Many journals have clear rules about what an abstract should look like. The reason the title and the abstract are important is about 80% of people only read the title and the abstract. Okay? So what do we think of this title and abstract? How could they have made the title and abstract better? If anyone wants these slides, I stole them from 10 other people. Just send me an email. I'll send you the slides. Seriously, there's nothing in these slides that are oh my God. It's copyrighted shit. I'll send you the slides. Just send me an email. What about this abstract could be better?
They could have put the outcomes separately, under a separate heading.
So they could have had, this is probably the journal stuff. So this is how this journal, again, some journals like Annals has very clear sort of consort methods of doing it. Let's just assume that the way this is structured is the way they structure it.
The results in the title sometimes.
So they could have told you in the title that it was a positive study. I would have liked in the methods and in the results, one of the things I really liked about the article is they told me what a positive decrease in symptom score was, right? They defined a clinically significant change. I would have loved to hear that in the results, because I read these results and I'm not sure what this means. I think it's good, but I'm not sure. So if in the methods they would have told me a score change of 6 points is clinically meaningful, and then the percent of people who had clinically meaningful, that would have been really helpful. They told me about quality-adjusted survival. I have no idea what quality-adjusted survival is until I read the article, and so I'm not sure what that means. What I would have rather they did in the methods is they would have told me what a clinically significant change was, and then put that in the results. Then I would have read the abstract and said, ooh, this is a clinically significant change. I can't tell that from reading it, and that makes me a little unclear, because what I wrote in the side is I put a question mark and I put, how important is this? Because what they tell you is that there was a 1.4 versus 7.1 point drop, and it's so? Because I don't know if any of you know what the HRQL is off the top of your head, and if you do, you shouldn't be at this talk. But, right? So I would have found that to be helpful. Okay. So, what should the introduction do? The introduction should motivate you. View the introduction like the first chapter of a mystery novel. What's the goal of a first chapter? What happens in 90% of first chapters in a mystery novel? Somebody dies. Often by nefarious means, right? Why do they have somebody die in the first chapter? What's the goal? What's the author's goal?
For you to continue reading.
He wants you hooked, or she wants you to be hooked in, right? So the goal of the introduction should motivate me to want to read the rest of the paper. If I read the introduction and it's oh yeah, so the author hasn't done a good job. It may be a really important paper, and I'm not motivated to read it, and they need to give me enough background to understand the needs of the paper, and they need to make their aims clear, which is why any good paper, if you go to the 2 sentences before the methods, they'll say, to address these questions, that's their aim. So why is one of the reasons to be a reviewer is that it teaches you how to write? You'll see people write all sorts of different ways of doing introductions. You'll begin to say, oh my God, when they do it that way, I can't figure out what they're really trying to do. And so you'll say, ooh, if I want to write for a biomedical journal, this is the sort of structure I need to have because it makes it really easy for me as a reviewer. So for this article, what did you think of the introduction?
I think they gave good rationale for why they're doing this in the first place.
Right. So the second paragraph basically tells you why they're doing the study. We just don't know these things. They give you references that if you pull up, it's sort of unclear. So they said, this is what we're going to study. Right? Okay. Methods. So the question, yeah. Yeah.
It's not my field, so I didn't understand it, but I think it's short introduction is good. Is that right?
Yeah.
This is very short.
So in biomedical journals, you get 4 paragraphs max.
But this is shorter than average.
It's 3 paragraphs. No, 2 paragraphs. Yeah, it's pretty short. They could have added a paragraph where they told, where they started off saying the effects are not established. They could have blown that up into its own paragraph and given me an example of how there's uncertainty, and then given me a 3rd paragraph where they started, therefore, to address these questions, right? So they could have given me 1 more paragraph. It would have helped me a little bit. In general, though, in no big journal, Annals, JAMA, BMJ, Lancet, will you see more than an introduction of 4 paragraphs? They're all the same. It's a little bit like reading fairy tales. They all start once upon a time. And as a reviewer, you will get used to them having the first 4 paragraphs. I joke that in any biomedical journal, if you tell me the paragraph, I can tell you what it says. That is, I can tell you what the argument of that paragraph will be, because they're so genre specific. And so as a reviewer, you're basically saying, are they meeting the genres? Now, you might like your stories told a little differently, right? Like everybody likes a mystery where you don't know who's really died. You may like it that way, and you can say that in your comments to the editor. Editors are not, they're conservative folk. They like it the way they like it. And if you try to write it differently or review differently, they won't like that. So at the end, I'm going to tell you how to write your review. Please write your review the way they want it, because they're reading zillions of them. And if you write your review in haiku, because you're really an innovative, poetic, sort of artistic kind of person, they just won't invite you back, which is sad. Oh my God, somebody sat in the front. Okay. So here are the things about methods. No study has perfect methods. Every study has to make choices about its methods because they don't have unlimited budgets. And so the question to ask yourself is, which way do the biases cut? That is, if there's a bias to the study, does it cut against their hypothesis, which means if they found something, their hypothesis is even more justified, or does it cut towards their bias, towards their hypothesis? The other thing is that most of us will read the statistical analysis and our eyes will glaze over. That's okay. For any big journal, they're having a statistician read it. And the question they want you to answer is, does it make sense why they're analyzing it this way rather than that way? So in a study like this, you would say, what did they do with the people who died? What did they do with the people who didn't fill everything out? What did they do for the sensitivity analysis? Did they, because they told you what a clinically significant change was, they said we conducted the analysis both for any level of change and for a 6-point change from baseline, which is considered clinically meaningful. So I don't care whether the statistician did it right or not, because I'm never going to be able to tell. But they clearly thought through, big questions that I would have, which is, does their change matter? And they told me that, and that makes me more confident in what they did. Okay? So what things bothered you, or would you have asked about the method? Yeah.
I was wondering if they took a look that the patient populations were really similar, and somehow,
So you would have wanted to know in the results whether the randomization worked or not. Okay? That's a common question to ask in any randomized controlled trial. That is, you try to randomize, did it work? What else? Yeah.
I noticed that for people who weren't as computer savvy, they didn't have to report as often.
Yeah, they seem to have two different interventions, one for the computer savvy people and one for the computer not savvy people. So the studies, they really were running two studies which were similar in one. And that bothered me a little bit.
Well, and frequency of checking in on
Because
your
they're right, they were different. What else bothered you? I didn't like their control. Their control was usual care. And the question they're asking is, does asking people to report their symptoms and then following up the symptoms make a difference? One objection you could have, given that quality of life is a subjective matter, it may have just been they were paying more attention to these people. And it wasn't really the fact that they were asking them about their symptoms that made a difference. It was that they were asking them anything. You could have argued that it'd be a slightly stronger study if they would have had them fill out a survey every time they came in about the New York sports teams, or their diet, or something that is clinically not relevant to their care. And then you could have said, and it was clearly a decision that they made. I just want them to justify their decision, because in these kinds of studies, it may be attention, not the specific content of the attention that made a difference. And so for me, it's sort of like, why did they choose basically a standard of care, which we know isn't very good, as their control? On the other hand, I really love that they told me what a clinically significant change was, and they looked at their analysis both ways, and they did sensitivity analysis for people who died. Okay. Now, what happens if it's a qualitative paper rather than a quantitative paper? Because the methods aren't the same, and so if you're not good at reviewing, or you don't understand what counts as a qualitatively rigorous study, my suggestion is when they ask you to review the article, you should say no. It's like you don't know the content. Because what counts as validity and reliability is different, and the way you show it is different. And it's okay if you don't know how to review qualitative work. You can just say, I basically only review quantitative work. In the same way, if largely you're a qualitative researcher and you don't sort of understand, you don't understand why they had 2-to-1 randomization and what power tests are and alpha are, you should probably just say, I'd rather not review quantitatively based papers. It's unfair to the authors. It would be like me saying, I'm gonna review music. I can review all country music, trust me. I can't review opera. If you ask me to review opera, first of all, I would be like, I would be that bad reviewer. I would say, I don't want to listen to opera. I hate opera. That's basically my review. And the reviewer would be like, you agreed to review an opera. I don't have any idea what constitutes a good or bad opera. Except for maybe that it's short. Carla.
you can tell all of these things just from the title, but I think most of the time when they give you a whole lot of information.
They send you an abstract. They almost always send you an abstract. Any of the big journals send you an abstract.
None of the big journals have it.
So if they don't send you an abstract and you get it and it's a quality,
Right.
just send them an email saying, this is a method that I'm not comfortable
So
in
it's okay,
reviewing.
like, say, yes, I'll do it, and then say,
Yeah.
no, I won't do it.
Well, if you don't feel confident, yes. I mean, if, let's say they sent you an article and the title was in English, and when you got it, it was in French. It would be okay to say, don't read French. Okay? Okay. Results. Are they clearly presented? Do they tell me what the sample is? This is I can tell, the first paragraph in results of any biomedical journal, first paragraph is sample. Always, first paragraph is sample. If the first paragraph isn't sample, they're doing some kind of drug. Do they answer their aims? Can I tell by reading the results, have they answered that question they gave me in that paragraph before the method? If I can't tell that from their answer, they haven't done their job. Did they follow the rules? And if you go to consortstatement.com, they give you a consort statement, which is the table figure 1, which is their consort diagram. Almost any big journal article that's a randomized controlled trial or a prospective trial will have a table that looks like this. You need to make sure that, one, their numbers match up. Because it's often the case that I go through in tables, and the most common thing I do is I just try to do the addition and make sure that I can follow where everybody went. I need to be able to understand, where did people go? Does it make sense? When I look at, for example, their consort diagram, what I'm really impressed by is they had 1,000 eligible patients, only 87 patients out of the basically 800, only 87 refused to participate. That's a consent rate of 90%. That's like, oh my God, they're New Yorkers. Really? So that raises a generalizability question for me. Because I don't know about the rest of you. How many people here do research? How many of you have ever had a 90% consent rate of living people? I mean, dead people. Sure, they all consent. 90% is amazing. And so I would have, in my review, I would have said, wow, your consent rate is really amazing. Tell me more. Because I worry that these people at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is a very unique kind of place, may then not be representative of the people that we see in business. That's why a consort diagram is really sort of interesting. Okay. A couple of things. First, they ought to have a point of view. Often you'll read papers, particularly from young people, that have 73 tables in them, and they're giving you all their data. It's okay for you to say, I think there's an interesting study here, and the authors haven't shown me what it is. I have to work too hard to figure out what their message is. That's a really helpful thing. It's even more helpful if you say, I wonder if the really good message here is this. Because then you've helped the authors out, you've helped them rewrite their paper, because you've given them a place to go when they do their rewriting. The second thing is, what happens if you read the paper and you don't agree? So it's a paper about the importance of putting in dialysis catheters in the right arm, and you're a left arm person. So I want you not to review it based on whether you agree with them or not. Your job is to say, have they made a strong argument supported by the evidence that they've given you? Not, do you agree that their conclusion is the right conclusion? If you can't review the article and do that, you shouldn't be reviewing the article. That is, many of us have certain biases about, for me, how often you should use opiates in people with life-limiting diseases, whether we're using too much opiates or too little opiates in our society, blah, 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 blah. I need to be able to review an article that makes an argument that opiates lead to bad things and maybe we're using too much. And if they make that argument, I need to put that article out in the world. It's a really bad reviewer who has a political or a theoretical stance and reviews things and won't let things go in that don't meet their theoretical stance. You're not a good reviewer. You're not helping science, which should be the interplay of those different views, get out there in the world. And I know that's really hard. So I'm going to really emphasize this, because often we read it and we say, oh, that can't be true. That isn't the question. The question is, did they show it to you? Is their data and their argument internally consistent? Not, do I believe it? Questions about that, because it's really important as a reviewer. So, the next thing I want you to look at is, are the tables and the figures helpful? Now, I want to tell you that you need to, some people love tables and figures. I never look at tables and figures. I read, because I don't like tables and figures. I'm not a visual person, so they don't help me a lot. And so when I'm a reviewer, I have to force myself to look at every table and figure and say, is it helpful? Does it add something? When I read what they wrote, do I need both the table, the figure, and the verbiage? Do they just say the same thing? Are they labeled correctly? That is, I should be able to look at any of these tables, and I should be able to say, if they just threw up table 2 as a slide, I know what they're talking about. And I ought to make sure the numbers add up. And so I'll often take a table and I'll just add the numbers and make sure they're consistent. So if you look at table 2, they have an N, and then they have the subgroup analysis. The subgroup analysis should meet the N, right? Because there are 2 subgroups, they're the total. And guess what? They do. You ought to do, as a reviewer, you ought to spot check and do that. Yeah.
What you said about the tables and figures being labeled correctly, but we don't want to have the tables and the figures and the text all saying the exact same thing just three different ways. Those seem exclusive. If I want them to just be able to look at the table and read it and know what I'm talking about.
So if I have a really good table, the goal of the text is to highlight the one thing from that table that's the most important to make my argument. So I'm parsimonious. I don't have to tell me. So when they look, when they look at the table, if you look at table 3, if you look at, table 3, they pulled out overall and quality adjusted survival. They pull out the most important things from that table and tell me that in the text. They don't tell me everything that's in the table in the text. And that's what typically happens in biomedical journals. That is, the text is telegraphic of what the bigger point is of the table. And it's often the case that if they give you a really long paragraph about the results, what you really want to say to them is, could you make this a table? And as a writer, you like tables because tables don't count against your word count. Just as a, side. Okay. So I've looked at the results. What's the goal of the discussion? What's the purpose of the discussion? The purpose of the discussion is to put it into context. I want you to see What do I add? How does it advance the science? What are the implications? What are the limitations? That's all I want from the discussion. The most common thing about discussions is that they're too long. And they just say the same thing that they've already said. The conclusion, which is basically the last paragraph of the discussion, is the moral of the story. What's the next step? Okay. You can look at the references. I just look at one or two of them, either because they're interesting or I just want to make sure that their claims match the reference. I don't look at every reference. I don't need them to do a literature review. What do you do if it's badly written? It's a pretty good paper and it's badly written. I'll often rewrite one paragraph for them, for the authors, and say, this paper needs to be proofread and copywritten so that it's tighter. For example, I would have changed this paragraph to this, and then I assume it's their job to do the rest. Don't rewrite their entire paper. They don't pay you enough. Okay. Now you write comments to the editor. These are comments that only the editor sees. That doesn't mean that you should let your id go wild. Editors are people too. You can put in their well-written paper, I just don't think it's important enough for the New England Journal. There, you can tell them whether you think they should accept it or not. Editors don't like it when you put whether you think you should accept it in the comments to the author, because that's not your job. That's the editor's job, and they don't want you like being a good cop, bad cop kind of thing, because then it's not helpful to them. If they're professional or plagiarism issues, put them in the comments to the editor. You then get to make a decision, which is accept with minor revisions, major revisions, and reevaluate or reject. Look, if you really don't like the paper and don't ever want to see it back again, don't say major revisions just because you don't want to tell them. Just say reject. Because what will happen is they'll make major revisions and they'll send it to you again. It's like, oh shit, I never wanted to see this again. But you said that it was salvageable. If you don't think it's salvageable, just say reject. It's a psychological thing. We hate to choose reject because it's like the last thing. There should be an option after it, which is reject, burn it, and never let me see it again. Then you'd be more likely to say reject. The comments to the author show your work. Tell them what they can do to make it better. Frame it positively, and be consistent with the comments for the editor. If you really don't think it's publishable, don't just tell them how fabulous it was in your comments to the author, because it doesn't help them, and then when it gets rejected, they won't know what they could have done to make it better. It's often helpful to divide your comments into major comments, which are big picture comments, and then minor comments where you do line editing or say specific things that you were unsure about. Don't rewrite the paper, frame it positively. I would have liked it better if you did this. It would make the paper more interesting if you would have given me this. This wasn't here, this would help me. The fact that you're anonymous doesn't mean that you can be mean. The other thing is that about a third of the time when I have papers get reviewed, I can tell who the reviewers are. Because when you say, I would have looked at this paper, this paper, this paper, it's almost always your own shit. I mean, just because of the way the world is. And, people, it's a small world. There's no reason to be mean. So one of the people say is, does the journal matter? The journal shouldn't matter for the content of your review. It matters for what I might tell the editor and what the editor decides. So, if it's a New England Journal paper, it's got to have a paper that's got a wide readability. I'll review something for the JAMA, and it's really a paper for a palliative care subspecialist. I'll say in my comment to the editor, interesting paper, not sure it's appropriate for JAMA because the scope of the argument is really for X. That's okay. It's also the case that I have this view that every paper has a home. So if it's not, if I'm reviewing for Annals or JAMA or Lancet, I have higher standards about what my comments are going to be to the editor about what I think should get in or not. It doesn't change my comments to the authors. It will change my comments to the editor. And the editor looks at it differently. Okay. Now, sometimes you get asked, have any of you got asked to re-review a paper that you said, okay. For me, the most important thing to do when I re-review a paper where I will spend 3/4 of my time is on the response letter. I don't want to spend 3 hours again reading the stupid paper. I want to be able to read the response letter and have them list all of my comments and show me exactly what they did to respond to them. Because that makes it really easy to skim the paper and write my letter back. And I have to say, I often will make my decision about what I'm going to do before I read the paper just by reading the response letter. That's an important message for those of you who are authors who do response letters. Make it really easy for people like me, who's a reviewer, to read that letter and say, these are all the comments, I did exactly these things. It's a cut and paste thing. Often the response letter is like 8 pages long because it's really important. And I will spend, I don't know about the rest of you, I'll spend almost all my time in the response letter. And then I'll look at the paper to make sure they said they were going to do things, that they did it, but it's basically the response letter. Okay. What do you do if you're reviewing an article for JAMA and you said, oh my God, never send it to me again, and then they send you the same article in the Journal of Palliative Medicine? Should you review it again? There's no clear answer to this. My view is that I probably won't review it again. Because if I really hated it for JAMA, it feels unfair that I'm the single person standing between it and publication. And because science is a community, I will say I've already reviewed this paper in another forum, someone else should review it. Because maybe someone else has a different view than me. Other people say, oh no, I know this will be really easy to review. I think it's up to you. I don't think that there's a right answer. It is really important that what you review is confidential. You're not supposed to share it with other people. You're not supposed to let others know that you read it. It is their intellectual property. It is interesting because often people will tell you that they reviewed a paper of yours. They almost only tell you that if they accepted it because they want you to like them, right? Just let it go. They're just sucking. Okay. So I think the real reason to review is it helps your colleagues write better papers. It also helps you write better papers because you get a better sense of what it is from the other side. My recommendation is write your reviews from a position of kindness, trying to help improve the work that others do. And to remember that when you're a reviewer, that you don't have to write you're not writing a paper. So spending more than 3 hours probably isn't worth it. And don't demand that the only paper that you ever accept is perfect, because there are no perfect papers. The question is their work good enough? Can you help them make it a little better? Question.